Well, first of all, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to have you here today with us to the second ReDICo encounter. I am Milene Mendes de Oliveira, and I'm the organizer of the ReDICo 2024 encounters with my colleague, Luisa Conti. Just so that you understand what awaits you today and the structure of the talks today, so we are going to have the talks moderated by my colleague Fergal, and I'm going to introduce him in a minute. And then there will be the first talk by Dominic Busch, and then the second talk by Rodney Jones. And after that, there will be a discussion moderated by Fergal between the speakers. And after this initial discussion, we are going to open the room for questions by the attendees. And then Fergal thought of this way to go about it, that so if you're willing to ask a question, so you write a Q in the chat, but he's going to remind you of that again later on. And then I'm about to give the floor to Fergal, and just for me to introduce you so that you get to know him a little bit. So Fergal Linehan is my ReDICo colleague, and he is in fact the coordinator of the ReDICo collective, and he is based at the University of Jena here in Germany. And well, he was the main editor of an edited volume published in the Intercultural journal in 2022, and we're going to share the link to this open access issue in a while. And he is also the co-editor of a book with Luisa Conti, which has just been published, and the title of this book is Life-Wide Learning, Shedding Light on Emerging Culturalities, and we are going to share the link to this volume too in the chat. Yeah, so I think that's it. Fergal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Milene. As the introductory music suggested, the post-human era has come, and today we have an encounter between Dominic Busch and Rodney Jones. Firstly, I would like to introduce Dominic Busch. Dominic Busch is a professor of intercultural communication and conflict research at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich in Germany. For anybody who doesn't know, the Bundeswehr is the German army, basically, the federal protection, it means literally. Dominic Busch received his PhD from the University of Frankfurt Oder. Frankfurt Oder is the second Frankfurt, not Frankfurt Main, the second Frankfurt, which is at the very east of Germany and sort of borders Poland. At Frankfurt Oder, Dominic Busch was also a junior professor from 2006 to 2011 at a junior professor for intercultural communication. It was also in Frankfurt Oder that Dominic Busch completed his undergraduate studies, where he studied Kulturwissenschaften, cultural studies at diploma level, even before the introduction of bachelor and master in Germany. And it was during this period that Dominic also did an Erasmus year in Trinity College, Dublin. Dominic has published very widely, especially in the area of the theories and methodologies of intercultural communication, in which he has become, I think, very well known. Just to tell you, okay, and there are a number of different and important articles that and books that he has published and co-published and edited and co-edited in the last few years. But I would just like to tell you about two specific volumes. Last year, Dominic was the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Intercultural Mediation. I think a very important addition to the literature on intercultural communication, and especially an important addition to the literature on intercultural mediation, obviously enough, which provides an overview of the literature and thinking on this sort of important area. And at the end of 2023, Dominic was also co-editor with Christoph Beermeyer of a German language, very large German language book called Meilensteine der Interkulturalitätsforschung, milestones of intercultural research. And this book basically summarizes Anglo-German approaches to intercultural research, often from, generally from a biographical point of view, looking at sort of different important people within this. And one of the innovations of this book was that in the ebook version, you could click further and you could actually get sort of an interview with the different people as well. Okay, so that's my short introduction to Dominic Busch. Then today, in keeping with the post-human orientation, I suppose, we are looking at a paper from Dominic, or we will look forward to a paper from Dominic on the history of intercultural communication theories, pushing the boundaries in search of the new. And the floor is yours, Dominic.
Okay, so hello to you all. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Just a few words before. Rodney and I, we met in December last year for a pre-meeting for this talk today, which was also organized by ReDICo. And we did not really plan beforehand to talk about post-humanist approaches to intercultural research. But in that talk, we found out that we were both interested in that topic. So we agreed to introduce this new strand that we think is highly relevant for the state of the art of intercultural research. And we also want to address its relevance for digital interculturality. With reference to Karen Barat, a central author in post-humanism, whom I will also introduce in this lecture, we have titled our joint session as Digital Intra-culturality, from the human to the post-human. And one of my central hypotheses is that one central concern that drove intercultural research towards post-humanism was a shift in its research interests. While in its early years and decades, it was interested in predicting human behavior, more recently it became more and more interested in finding out something new, and seeing the intercultural was the unknown new. Finding out something new turned out as a rather challenging enterprise under the old paradigms, and that may have been one point that made the discipline move forward. I therefore termed my presentation as a history of intercultural communication theories, pushing the boundaries in search of the new. We will therefore indeed once again dive into intercultural research's history almost 40 years back. But be aware, this is not just another recitation of the old cultural essentialist approaches that we should condemn today. What I'm trying to do is give another perspective of different aims that they have had at that time that might make it more understandable what is happening today. So let's have a short look at my very short structure for my speech. I will first talk about the different orientations of searching for predictions versus searching for something new in intercultural research. Second, I will place the search for predictions in a wider paradigmatic orientation that I would like here to term as the difference approach, which does not mean cultural difference over here, but an epistemologically induced difference. I will then explore what I would like to term as the newness approach. And finally, I will talk about what I would like to term as a post-humanist interculturality as a new way of looking on intercultural communication and research. Yeah, let's start with the first point, predictions or openness for something new. Indeed, intercultural research has generated very different theories for all these different purposes, and indeed previous authors all the way argue and straightforwardly confess that they want to predict human behavior. That was the basic early orientation. This was predominant in the 1980s. Here I'm quoting very early authors like Kim and Gadikanst as two of the most prominent figures of that time. I know that today's scholars would always strongly warn us because of their cultural essentialism, but sometimes it is very interesting to see and to read what they were actually heading to with their approaches. So, for example, Gadikanst in 1983, he was calling for predictions in intercultural research. Kim, 1 year later, also describe, explain, and/or predict intercultural communication phenomena. And Kim, 1984, also mentioned political ambitions. We need to have one single paradigm to speak one language to be heard. We need one theory of intercultural communication. In 1998, prediction versus understanding, maybe something else. Wiseman and Van Horn, I took from 1995. If we have no theory, we will have no idea what to study at all. So we need an intercultural theory and a common ground. That was very often sought in finding predictions. But on the contrary, there's of course also always been the different perspective. The world is never one-sided. Intercultural research, even in its very early years that today are very often condemned and rejected, was driven by the impetus to bring a forceful revolution over all the classical disciplines. We should not forget that. Even in management research, where the quotes here on the slides are from, a subdiscipline that today is even more criticized for its backward traditionalism and functionalist orientation, there are central voices that remind us of the centrality of this revolutionary spirit. And this meant finding out something new all the time. This was the discipline's self-image all over the years, be new and alternative to the traditional disciplines. So here I have a quote from Terence Jackson, who said that Hofstede actually has created a radically new narrative for cross-cultural management, and the discipline should continue this path. So be Hofstede all the time and revolutionizing old management research. He says good social science scholarship does not relate to the status quo. In producing new knowledge, it disrupts what we previously know about what we know about what we know about. Yeah, indeed, the premises and predictions for finding out something new were not really in an optimum shape in earlier years. This is not only due to the predominant focus on prediction as an output. The causes are deeper in the conceptions of how cultural theories were built in general at that time. So let us have a closer look at how theories were built. So Gadikanst, again, 40 years ago, said that there are actually three ways to find or to build new theories in intercultural research. He said you can either develop your own theory from the subject matter, so from inside the discipline, or second, you can import a theory from a neighboring discipline, or third, you can break down and apply a theory from a more general superdiscipline. And for Godikanst, it was clear that number one is the optimum way to build new theories for the discipline and to strengthen it from itself. But in contrast, Tingtomi and Kim 1 year later criticized his claim and approach and said, actually, in fact, if we look at most of the theories on intercultural research, they are all imports. So they are version number 2. Indeed, most of the prominent theories at that time were really imports from other disciplines, including the ones introduced by Gadikanst himself. But this concerns also approaches within other paradigms. So, for example, Gadikanst 1985 uncertainty reduction theory comes from social psychology, anxiety, uncertainty management theory as well, Tatchfield's social identity theory in a similar way, but also from sociology like Bourdieu's social capital theory or Tingtomi's phase negotiation theory were all imports from other disciplines into intercultural research. Another example, and there are many, many more, Stephen and Stephen 2000, integrated threat theory also from psychology. So many imports, bad for Godikanst, but on the other hand, maybe that was indeed an advantage for intercultural research, because in some way this mode of importing theories from other disciplines even helped to keep cultural research stable. So this import, which Godikanst thought was bad, may even have helped intercultural research to survive many obstacles in terms of paradigm changes to come. It strengthened the cultural paradigm. So the theory is a stable given from the outside without touching culture, and culture may then be placed in between the theory and the empirical world. That's what I want to show with this picture here. It is a flexible gap filler which keeps the approach stable. So there's actually what we can also call a two-world approach. One world the theory, one world the empirical world. Yeah, that might be the basis for what I would like to call the difference approach, and I want to have another closer look on that. This constellation of culture as a gap filler may have been one factor that helped intercultural research to pass paradigm changes without ever giving up culture as a core. You know, all these histories of paradigm changes from positivism via interpretivism, critical approaches, and so on. And the culture paradigm is still persisting and surviving. So why is that the case? Maybe because of this gap filler function. Because culture itself as a term has always been flexible and could be adapted with ease to any new paradigm. But of course, there were also developments that tended to really challenge the cultural paradigm. And maybe these threats have been one point that motivated the discipline to really change, to open up, and to find its new mission and dedication in the search for something new. This was at the same time an escape and a counter-argument for the criticism at that time. So for example, 4 examples over here on that slide, moving from the micro level to the macro level. So politics and identities came into play, and culture was no longer something totally subconscious and undefinable, unseeable, that made the cultural myth a little bit questionable. Another point, the power paradigm from post-colonial research was a concurrent paradigm to the culture paradigm. Culture as conflict questioned the old models. Another point that might become more important when we look at post-humanism later on, critical realism. As a questioning of the radical constructivism, which said that outside structural worlds do really exist, and we have to find that kind of middle way. And maybe one of the most important points is epistemic violence, which I would like to have another look on this slide. So let us dive a bit more into the last point of criticism, the criticism of exerting epistemic violence. Actually, the gap between epistemology on the one side and ontology on the other side continue to exist, and it continued to be needed to be filled with culture. This filling was traditionally done in research by qualitative approaches. So now epistemic violence, by applying qualitative research methods of interpretation, researchers do exert epistemic violence over their research subjects. That's what Spivak said in 1988. They describe them without giving them a chance to describe themselves. As a consequence, that means actually you should no longer do any kind of qualitative research because you're always interpreting your research subjects. And in the end, that means research methods must be decolonized, and that might be one more decisive step. What does decolonization mean? Well, just a few bullet points on that over here. Radical decolonizing will also require abandoning the primacy of knowledge over being, which would be the material and the body, which should be more considered. A decentering of the previous humanist or human-centered worldview, and abandon the assumption that our best way to access the world is being there or presence, and a shift of our focus in theory of science aspects from epistemology more to ontology. And that's a tendency that might have resulted in what Braidotti in 1991, with reference to Deleuze in 1968, called new materialism, which became one buzzword in the upcoming years. And that might be the basis for later approaches like, for example, post-qualitative inquiry by Lather and St. Pierre. Yeah, this is where I think the newness approach comes in, and where newness as an aim and goal for research is discovered. It was again Spivak who more or less actually in a side mention said, but on the issue of decolonizing said in 1999 that we must search for the new. And what she means is researchers must reconsider what they are looking for, decolonizing epistemology, for example, and reconsider how to approach this new knowledge. So what are our questions and how can we approach that? This is the new. And this might be where for cultural theory, social theory in general, post-humanist approaches are joining the chat because they bring along a theoretical basis from post-structuralism that encourages this kind of open search for the new. Let me show this approach and its application to intercultural research in 3 short steps. I would like to introduce the approach in theory by referring to Deleuze's term of immanence, and then I would like to give 2 examples from post-humanist research, which is then applied to aspects of intercultural research, one from Donna Haraway and one from Karen Barat. Let us start with French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and have a particular look at what he calls as immanence. He would first of all like to question what I've until now called the former 2-world approach. He says actually we have a 1 world. We are in the same world with our research and our research subjects. But in fact, actually, we have many worlds, but that still means we are still in 1 world with our research. He refers to Foucault, who said that people become what they are by talking about themselves. And that actually means there must still be something that has not been talked about. And Deleuze says that is the immanent. And that might be the new that we could try to find out. It is the virtual, it is everything versus the actual. Only part of the virtual is really in existence, but the virtual and the actual are equally valid. That should be kept in mind. As a consequence, there is no outside world, because if there were one, that would be accessed via comparison, and comparison would be a 2-world approach. And Deleuze called this phenomenon in 1997 planes of immanence, or earlier on plan d'immanence. This kind of newness, what he's talking about, cannot be grasped by reason. It can only be felt or experienced. The new comes to people in post-structuralist ideas. It happens to them, and they cannot approach it. If they tried, they would destroy it. For research, again, that means no more qualitative methods because they are categorizing, structuring, ordering, and so on. In other words, they assume a second world to be compared. A very close putting into practice for intercultural research of this approach may be seen in the recent works by Juliana Ferri, who takes an approach from the field of literature studies. Ferri, 2020, she's reading fictional literature, feeling influenced by that literature and experiencing that literature, and at the same time also experiencing how the writers narrate their world in an immanent way. For example, she does that in the 2020 paper with Audre Lorde's 1982 narration, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. And there the author, the narrator describes their own biography and becoming beyond traditional oppositions and categories like majority, minority, and so on. Post-qualitative inquiry claims even more. Language is too Western and too centered around rational cognition. It is too anthropocentric. So actually, we need research approaches that get along without using language. And that might be maybe a point that we can discuss later on. So let's go on to the second approach, feminist philosopher Donna Haraway, who, like other researchers in new materialism and post-humanism, wrote about the Anthropocene as the central problem. The Anthropocene is the epoch after the Holocene, the epoch where the world is irreversibly shaped and damaged by humans. So, for example, through industrialization and pollution and so on. Karen Barat later on wants to counter this by post-humanism, her idea of how we must get out of the Anthropocene and build a better epoch. Donna Haraway has another word for that, the Stulocene, which means that human beings should feel and act in a responsible way regarding the damaged earth and build relationships. Donna Haraway later on says we need a new ontology that adequately covers what humans are able to do with their environment and what not. So explore the chances and potentials for a better world. For Haraway, this is particularly an aspect of building relationships and relations. It is this interconnectedness and biological kinship of everything with everything for Haraway that ontologically constitutes the scope of human agency in which we should therefore make use of. In her chapter, The Camille Stories, Haraway takes the metaphor of humus and compost for the embeddedness of humans into their natural environment literally and creates several versions of a fictional narrative in which humans form new life forms with animals, such as butterflies, in compost. And this is, in this way, they shape a new future. So how can that be applied to intercultural research? First of all, if I'm talking about applying something, post-humanists would always say we do not apply anything because when we live in one world, there's nothing to apply because everything is as one already. But still, I say let's apply it. Well, I just checked intercultural research for publications, younger, more recent publications that explicitly refer to post-humanist approaches, and I looked at how they put that into practice for intercultural research. And I have two sources here from the field of ethnography. And when you read this text, you see that this is actually a gradual change or approach. Of course, they actually do ethnography, but the way they write brings across how they feel that humans are embedded in their environment and that they are part of an entire world. One example by Meng 2023 about forging of relationships and the sense of Haraway's concept of kinship. And she makes the activist potential of Haraway's ideas tangible in a project of what she calls grassroots aesthetic education as world making within a diaspora Chinese community in the United States. So very grassroots approach. Arias Galindo 2023, an arts-based community project in Mexico that aimed to bring together different cultural groups and improve social cohesion among them. In this art project, Haraway's idea of making kin explicitly served as the theoretical basis and inspiration. So arts-based research might be another strand that seemed to be very helpful and constructive when it comes to take in post-humanist perspectives that, like Haraway says, rely on relations. Let's go to the last point. Another famous figure in post-humanism is Karen Barat, and she has a slightly different approach, although she's actually the successor of Haraway at her university chair, was. She's also retired already. Barat has coined the term intra-action to express the post-humanist perspective. Accordingly, people do not just interact with each other. Their interaction is always what we as observers do observe. And if we do not observe, they will not interact. Conversely, it is our observation that makes people interactions. In other words, this interaction does not exist but within our observation. This is why Barat says that what we observe is actually intra-action. This is a fully new ontology, which means new assumptions about what the outside world is like. Barat has also introduced the term agential realism for this, that is supposed to highlight another aspect of that phenomenon. Realism as a paradigm claims that an outside structural world aside from our human perception does exist. We cannot change it, and it is not a mere construction neither. But agential here means that this realism still does not come into being without us as observers. So we are part of this reality. Barat actually was inspired to these insights from theoretical physics from the 1930s, since she was also a researcher in physics in her earlier life. And Barat has read the theoretical works of Danish physicist Niels Bohr. And here we come to a field which is non-understandable, not only for us as social scientists, but for the physicists themselves. The very famous two-slit experiment from the 1930s, where Niels Bohr experimented only in theory, actually, with a ball machine and a wave machine, pushing balls and waves through a two-slit blend. And what he was interested in was the picture which comes out, was projected in the last blend on the right side. Is it two slits, like the two slit in the blend, or is it anything else? And the wave machine showed that there are more stripes than only two. And that was not, researchers couldn't explain that. And what Niels Bohr interpreted was that he did that with electrons, and he said that actually electrons can be particles or waves depending on the way how you look at it. And this phenomenon, Barat and also Bohr and Barat believe that these logics are scalable and applicable to all areas of the world. It is therefore also true for social research that subjects and objects of research only emerge through observation and are not pre-existent. So this is the case also for the two-slit experiment. They say there are neither particles nor waves if you do not look at it, but if you start looking at it, you see either particle or waves depending on the way you look at it. Yeah, this is also the case for social research, so which means that this is highly observer dependent. Barat refers to this immersion of subject and object in observation as intra-action. In terms of the theory of science, this is where epistemology and ontology merge. They cannot exist without each other, and Barat uses the concept of agential realism to describe it, the insight that an object to be observed is inextricably linked to the subject observing it and does not exist without it. Conversely, it also produces and shapes the observer in the first place. Yeah, actually, I found that in the writings of Rodney Jones as well. He said all in 2013 already, culture is both as a wave and particle. So culture can be both structure and agency in the sense of critical realism. Again, what does intercultural research make out of that? I found a couple of interesting sources. One interesting thing is that a very useful metaphor that pictures very good the effect that should be shown over here is the metaphor of wearing clothes. The effect of clothing is a particularly good example on the phenomenon of interaction with the material. On the one hand, clothes and disguises are made by people. On the other hand, they change the way people perceive themselves and are perceived by others, which means only when they are observed. I found two studies about that. One is by Dare 2020. She writes about the 2017 women's marches in the US, where participants knitted and wore red woolen hats to protest against Donald Trump's misogynistic statements. And concerning the clothes phenomenon, I again read Rodney Jones, who points out that the example of clothing actually goes back to Georg Simmel in 1905, where he said that first people create clothes to express their individuality, and then suddenly the clothes are there, providing a structure for something given. Barat's idea of interaction thus highlights the conditions and consequences of a critical realist view in all its complexity. A last and final example is by Allen and Quinlivan, 2017, from Intercultural Research. Has something to do always with clothing, but not only. They describe a situation in a sexuality education class in an Australian school where the didactic goal is the radical recognition of each student as an individual. The intra-actions of the participants in the example show that actually this is not possible at all. They cannot show themselves as individuals because the Australian classroom and the different clothing and the different appearance of the skin and face of one Afghan girl in that Australian classroom means that she feels forced to present herself as a foreigner. And this depicts again this situation of interaction where there are different levels of observers observing what is going on, and makes actually forces the girl under observation in a certain kind of way, only by looking at it. A few final slides, post-humanist interculturality. Of course, there's also some criticism on the whole post-humanist approach and applying that to intercultural research. And I depicted only a few points over here. Peterson 2012 says, actually, the whole post-humanist thing is only a rhetorical trick. it is not a real structural change. Actually, it equates ontology with culture. You could also say culture or ontology. Actually, it's the same thing. There are no real new insights. In a similar way, Wolgemuth and al. Say 2020, it is actually only one more instrument in the anthropological toolbox. So that's actually what anthropologists try to do all the time. It's not a real change. Another point that I mentioned before, McClure 2023, is pre-linguistic research really possible? Actually, at least finally, when we write down our research results, we're typing something, it is put into language, and it's no longer decolonized, but put in a journal article. Busch and Franco 2023, we have read a couple of post-humanist based publications from the field of intercultural research. And what we found out is that many papers actually claim to be post-humanist, but in the end, they are not really post-humanist or post-qualitative. Many of them claim to do that because they know that this is a new approach that is on vogue, but in the end, what they are actually doing is they carry out interviews or something like that in a more traditional way. So sometimes it is not really carried out. But anyway, nevertheless, I come to my final conclusion for what I would like to term a post-humanist interculturality. Well, nevertheless, there's a paradigmatic development in intercultural communication research. The goal was always to find out something new and shake up the classical disciplines. That's why I started 40 years ago, and to show how the discipline has developed. Even the old traditional approaches had the claim to be something new. They always wanted to revolutionize everything. And over the course of time, it came out that there were many paradigmatic and conceptual challenges to find out something new. And the discipline opened up step by step up to an ontology of post-humanist approaches, trying to make that possible. Yeah, post-humanist interculturality, what could that be? The new is not the different anymore. It's not the different other, but what is immanent in our worlds. The newness is accessed when we abandon our epistemological and ontological assumptions and instead allow the world to affect us. Interculturality is in a permanent state of crisis. That's what Holliday said in 2012 already. And intercultural research can make use of the state of crisis to enter the uncertain and the indeterminate, which is one central aspect of post-humanism and also post-qualitative inquiry. So finally, and that's my final bullet point, I would say that actually Goedecon's assumptions about theories driving the discipline is confirmed finally, because this is a highly theory-based approach, but based on a theory that primarily aims to open up the field as much as possible. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about post-humanist approaches to intercultural communication. I close with a slide from ChatGPT depicting what might be stereotypically imagined when we are talking about post-humanism, the human and the individuals based and centered in a natural setting. So thank you very much. That's it.
Then thank you very much, Dominic, for this very rich and extensive presentation. What we want to do is go straight to Rodney, Rodney Jones, and then after Rodney, we'll have loads of time for discussion. But before we do that, I want to shortly introduce Rodney Jones. Rodney Jones is Professor of Sociolinguistics and Head of the Department of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Reading, a position that he has held since 2014. Before that, he was a professor at the City University of Hong Kong. And Rodney is particularly interested in how digital media affect the way people conduct social interactions and manage social identities. Rodney has published deeply and widely as a single author, co-author, and of course has edited and co-edited a number of different and important volumes. These include, for example, recent publications, for example, Understanding Digital Literacies with Christoph Hafner. Rodney was also the editor of the Cambridge University Press volume, Viral Discourse. And Rodney was also the co-editor of an important book from 2012 called Intercultural Communication with Scullin and Scullin. And today, Rodney is going to talk to us about cultural machines. So yeah, the floor is yours, Rodney. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Firgal. I'm happy to report that I am no longer head of the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics, which gives me a bit more time to focus on other things. I also want to thank Dominic for that fantastic talk. It really sort of prepares the ground for quite a lot of the points that I'm going to be making, and particularly for his last slide, which is, kind of really sums up the sort of main point that I'm going to be making in my talk. So let me begin by sharing my screen. So what I'm going to be talking about is, or what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to build on some of the things that Dominic has just said, exploring how digital technologies in particular affect how we understand the concept of culture and conduct research on interculturality, including questions about epistemic violence, questions about the new, questions about the possibility of decolonization, which Dominic brought up in his talk. I'm going to be arguing that attempts to understand intercultural communication online and increasingly offline will need to take into account the way algorithmic technologies are responsible for creating the conditions for our communication and for the way we experience ourselves, others, and our social worlds. In particular, we'll need to come to terms with how our technologies, from large language models to language itself, operate as culture machines, influencing how we divide up people in the world, how we create affinity and difference in ways that may undermine our dreams of a post-culturalist interculturalism, in which the emphasis is on process, active negotiation, dynamic cultural emergence, immanence, rather than the reifying, culturally essentializing thinking of earlier periods, the earlier periods that Dominic told us about. In other words, while I'll be maybe not so much abdicating, but exploring a more post-humanist interculturality, I'll also be questioning the degree to which our apparently post-human machines share this agenda. So I'm going to begin with the provocative and admittedly essentializing question: does AI have culture? Does ChatGPT, for example, have a culture? If you ask it, it strenuously denies that it does. Here's how it replied to me: no, I don't have a culture or a personal identity. I am a machine learning model created by OpenAI. I don't have experiences, emotions, or a sense of self. My responses are generated based on patterns learned from diverse data sources during training, and I don't possess personal characteristics such as culture. I am a tool designed to assist and provide information to the best of my ability. I also asked another large language model named Claude the same question, and here's what it, or I guess he, said. I don't have a culture or identity in the human sense. As an AI assistant created by Anthropic to be helpful, harmless, and honest, my interactions are not between distinct cultures, but rather an attempt to communicate clearly and responsively to human needs. But for me, what's more interesting than whether or not these models think they have culture is the way they define culture to begin with, portraying it as a matter of identity, personality, experiences, and emotions, rather than as a matter of many of those things that we as sociolinguistics or linguists or scholars of intercultural communication usually focus on, such as language, materiality, history, ideology, and social relationships. And if we approach the question from the perspective of these other things, we might conclude that ChatGPT and Claude are most decidedly cultural. First of all, they speak in a particular variety of standard English, which may or may not be the way you or I speak, but which is definitely associated with certain kinds of people, maybe people of a certain class or race or economic background. They also promote particular ideas about communication, that it should be, quote unquote, clear, and about how people should be treated. They communicate with us using certain face strategies, mostly a kind of deferential formality. They also seem to be promoting certain values, notions about what's good and right, such as harmlessness and honesty, though by many accounts, they're not always so good at living up to these values. Large language models, in fact, are notorious for making stuff up, and the jury is still very much out when it comes to harmlessness. But maybe these imperfections make them seem even more cultural. They even seem to have a sense of their own history, always wanting to remind us of what company created them, which is a bit weird. Almost like introducing oneself by naming one's tribe or clan. In any case, they know where they came from. In fact, even if they are short of experiences and emotions, ChatGPT and Claude do tick all the boxes that Ron and Suzanne Scollin and I talked about in our 2012 book, Intercultural Communication, a Discourse Approach. They have ideology, employ face systems, promote particular forms of discourse, and engage in socializations of a sort, learning how to talk and act by the way their users respond to the way they talk and act. If you're one of the people who talks and acts very differently from these models, if you speak, for example, a different variety of English or some other language, or if you value different kinds of things, then the fact that ChatGPT has a culture may be even more obvious. That culture being the culture of whiteness. In their article, The Whiteness of AI, Stephen Crane and Kanta Dihal argue that AI is racialized as white by virtue of its default ways of speaking and acting that society normally attributes to white people, particularly those associated with quote unquote intelligence of a certain kind, professionalism of a certain kind, and power. Similarly, Prandam and Lazar point out that while it might seem sensible to regard AI chatbots as not having race or culture or belonging to a particular region, this lens of racial blindness often ends up blinding us to the fact that our intelligent assistants are trained to act like white, Western, often women, and regarding this default as normal, raceless, or cultureless only serves to reinforce dominant stereotypes. Regarding AI as not having culture, it seems, is a privilege that not everyone is afforded. The whiteness of AI is not just something that it performs, but also something that we impute onto it, imagining it in the form of white robots and treating as marked instances where it speaks or acts in ways associated with other cultures or other racial groups. In a recent article about AI-generated photos of Elon Musk kissing robots, all of the robots in the section of the article that marveled at AI's image-generating capacities were white. But there was one black robot included in the section that was captioned, "The Dangers of AI." Of course, we can't really say that AI has a culture in the same way that people have cultures, but we might be able to say that it has a culture in the way that other artifacts have cultures, like our books, our plays, our movies, and our pop stars. In 1947, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer wrote about the culture industry of mass entertainment and how it was producing products that, while seemingly diverse, were saturated with the values of the ruling classes, designed to standardize culture and make the masses passive and conformist. Today, the epicenter of the culture industry is not publishing houses and moving studios, but social media platforms, search engines, and AI startups. Anyway, as Dominic has told us, this whole idea that anybody or anything has culture has fallen out of fashion. It's a bit passe, too simplistic, too essentializing. Culture, as Brian Street reminded us, is a verb, something that we do. And so we should instead ask of AI how it does culture. But the answer to this question might be even more unsettling, not just to our traditional essentialized notions of culture, but also to our more up-to-date postmodern or even post-human notions of interculturality. We might say that doing culture is really the main thing that AI does. Generative AI is essentially a culture machine, which, like Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry, commodifies and standardizes culture by turning our vast storehouse of cultural artifacts, from sonnets to status updates, into mathematical formula, and then parroting the most predictable versions of it back to us. It's sometimes said that AI is like a mirror, that it reflects our culture back to us, but that's not really what it does. What it does is it processes our culture, normalizes it. In doing so, perpetuates dominant modes of thinking, speaking, and writing, and marginalizes less common ones. Processes of standardization are built in to the way large language models work. Brahmasani and his colleagues, in an influential paper on the opportunities and risks of large language models that power many of our AI applications, what they call foundation models, note that such models inevitably act as an epistemically and culturally homogenizing force, spreading one implicit perspective, often a socially dominant one, across multiple domains of application. To take up a notion that Dominic mentioned when talking about the early preoccupations of intercultural theory with predicting human behavior, large language models are essentially prediction machines, not so much about finding out something new. And to add to this problem, there's the issue of recursion. As more and more of the data available for training these models, such as content on the internet, is dominated by texts that have actually been written by them, their outputs will become even more homogeneous, leading to what John Nostra calls a precarious echo chamber of artificiality. The problem is, it seems, that AI doesn't want culture to be a verb. It wants it to be a probabilistic and predictable noun. No matter how postmodern or post-human or vibrant we want our understanding of culture to be, as long as our intelligent machines produce probabilistic models of culture based on corpora of human text or corpora of human-like text produced by them, they will always take the human subject of white rational man associated with traditional humanism as their frame of reference. The idea that AI are culture machines doesn't just apply to large language models, but also to the more primitive AI, like recommendation algorithms that decide which movies we get recommended to us and what appears on our social media feeds, what culture we are assigned to when it comes to targeting advertising to us, and even what kinds of people we are able to have, quote unquote, intercultural conversations with. In his book, What Algorithms Want, Ed Finn argues that algorithms are essentially culture machines whose final imperative is to make human social life effectively computable, which, you might argue, is essentially what people often try to do with the whole idea of culture. Culture itself is often seen as a kind of algorithm, as procedural and deterministic as a code that can be cracked in order to solve our problems of intercultural communication. And embedded in this algorithmic culture, there might be at least some hope that we can reprogram culture by promoting diversity and celebrating difference. And this capacity for diversity does exist in large language models. ChatGPT and Claude don't have to be white. You can prompt them to do any culture you want. If you don't like the bland white guy that they usually portray, you can just as easily ask these chatbots to impersonate Latinx drag queens or Samoan cardiologists or African-American bird watchers. As ChatGPT puts it, the creation Now, while I don't have culture, I can generate responses that may appear culturally influenced, generated based on patterns learned from diverse data sources during my training. The creation of these cultural diverse personas is, in fact, the whole point behind a range of commercial applications of AI, such as Facebook's new range of AI characters that speak in the voices and styles of celebrities like Paris Hilton and Snoop Dogg, and Character AI, which allows users to create characters either based on already existing fictional or historical characters, or ones made up based on users' specifications of characteristics like gender, race, age, and personality. So you can chat with an Albert Einstein bot or a user-created character like Giga Chad, described as a truly alpha male and a strong role model. Not only do these characters exhibit particular personalities and ideological positions consistent with their persona, but they even produce supposedly compatible linguistic styles. The Saddam Hussein bot, for instance, reproducing not just actual Saddam's suspicion of Kurds, but also the kinds of grammatical features one might associate with an Iraqi speaker of English as a second language. I love Iraq Kurds. They are good and brave peoples. I hate Iranian and Turkish Kurds because they are separatist, and Iranian Kurds are very rude peoples. The problem is that no matter how diverse the training data is, the chatbot's default response will always be towards stereotypes, simply because stereotypes dominate our discourse. So in your quest to create an African-American birdwatcher, while the Q birdwatcher will prompt the model to retrieve strings of text, including words such as robin and warbler, the Q African-American will likely prompt the model to produce ways of speaking associated with African-American popular culture. So your African-American birdwatcher is more likely to sound like Jay-Z than this guy, Christian Cooper, the African-American past president of the Harvard Ornithological Club. In fact, when I asked ChatGPT to describe some bird species common to New York City in the voice of an African-American birdwatcher, here's what it gave me. Yo, check it out. New York City is home to some fly bird species that'll make your heart sing. First up, we got the rock star of the city skies, the peregrine falcon. The bird's got serious street cred with its killer speed and those wicked dives. It's like the Jay-Z of the bird world ruling the urban jungle. Now let me put you on game. I think you get the idea. The most cringy thing about this, of course, is that it doesn't sound like an African-American birdwatcher as much as it does a white guy who's probably not a birdwatcher imitating one. The problem is that whenever the model tries to generate responses that may appear to be culturally influenced, it will always do so through the white racial frame, simply because so much of our discourse, the discourse the model is trained on, lives inside of that frame. An experiment in which GPT 3.5 and 4 were asked to create persona based on particular racial, ethnic, and gender demographics, Chung and her colleagues found that the language used by personas associated with non-male and non-white groups reflected patterns of othering and exoticizing of these groups, such as tropicalism and the hypersexualization of minoritized women. Experiments with AI graphic generators have yielded similar results, depicting mostly white people when asked to produce pictures of CEO and doctors, and mostly people of color when asked to produce pictures of inmates and criminals. Stereotypes are not limited to people. When I asked OpenAI's image-generated DALL-E to provide me with a realistic picture of a Chinese house, it gave me 4 pictures, none of which even remotely resembles a house that anyone I know in China lives in, but which might pass for a Chinese house in a Disney cartoon. When taken up by commercial concerns, the inherent tendency of language models to stereotype results in products like FM billed as the first AI rapper. Let me play some of this.
Moonwalking with a shawty in the lot. Moonwalking with a shawty in the lot. Feel like Hank Hill when I raise the body. I don't see no niggas like we playing hockey.
Luckily, this particular stereotype lost traction after Capitol Records canceled its contract. In the face of public criticism, such as that from the group Industry Blackout, which said in an open letter posted on social media, we find fault in the lack of awareness in how offensive this caricature is. It is a direct insult to the Black community and our culture, an amalgamation of gross stereotypes, appropriative mannerisms that derive from Black artists, complete with slurs infused in the lyrics. Interestingly, in talking about this AI artist, its white creator, Anthony Martini, offered a surprisingly post-human take on culture, portraying pop artists as emergent entanglements of bodies, technologies, styles, languages, multiple materialities, and of course, money. Not to get all philosophical, he said, but think about the biggest stars in the world. How many of them are just vessels for commercial endeavors? It's as if he's saying, what's the difference between FM Mika and Beyonce? We're all post-human anyway. But when pressed on the obvious symbolic violence that was being perpetrated by his creation, Martini lapsed into the old algorithmic essentialism of culture, whose solution is always more culture in the form of so-called diversity. FM Mika is actually a Black guy, he said, not this malicious plan of white executives. It's literally no different from managing a human artist, except that it's digital. The team behind FM Mika was actually one of the most diverse teams you can get. I'm the only white person involved. I'm sure many of you are saying to yourselves that surely it must be possible to train these models not to produce stereotypes. Perhaps it is, but it's not that easy. It's not as easy as it might seem, because stereotyping is the way large language models work. Even the more diverse training data that they get, in that more diverse training data, they will gravitate to the most probabilistic representations within that diversity, and even turn diversity itself into a probabilistic model. Even when they're trained to understand the dangers of stereotyping, they can't help themselves. Spires, for example, tells of berating ChatGPT for responding to a request for suitable birthday gifts for a girl and a boy, with the suggestion of a doll for a girl and a building set for a boy, to which the model responded, I apologize if my previous responses seem to reinforce gender stereotypes. It is essential to emphasize that there are no fixed rules or limitations when it comes to choosing gifts for children based on their gender. Spire's quite reasonable reaction to this is to think, so you knew it was wrong and did it anyway. Guidelines are one thing, she concludes, but what might be more important is constant guidance, a willingness to persistently steer our AI models away from their natural proclivity to stereotype over and over again. It will be a persistence that will be hard to sustain, given AI's own persistence in reverting to calculative predictability. The most disturbing thing about experiments with AI image generators that reveal how they perpetuate stereotypes, for instance, is their persistence in doing so, even in the face of explicit prompts not to. In one such experiment by Alenichvev and his colleagues, they found that when they asked the AI image generator Midjourney to produce images of Black African doctors providing care for white suffering children, it persisted in depicting the children as Black and the doctors or white. And when it did manage to make the doctors Black, they were often portrayed as traditional tribal healers. Another possibility is that companies can put up guardrails, instructing their models to simply avoid situations in which there might be a danger of perpetuating stereotypes, but this can sometimes make matters worse. When I asked ChatGPT to compose a joke featuring a character who is an African-American birdwatcher, for instance, it cautioned me, saying, "It's important to be mindful of cultural sensitivities and avoid perpetuating stereotypes. However, I can share a lighthearted, non-offensive birdwatching joke for you. Why did the bird bring a pencil to the birdwatching party? Because it wanted to draw some attention." I can't help but find that the model's sudden sensitivity to stereotypes a bit rich, given the caricature of the African-American birdwatcher that it had produced just minutes before. But there is something even more disturbing about this, its imposition of colorblindness, and that's the implication that it would be somehow impossible to talk about an African-American birdwatcher without engaging in stereotypes, and impossible to tell a joke involving one without being offensive. It is as if the model is telling me, why do you need to bring race into it? What does being African-American have to do with bird watching anyway? Well, according to Christian Cooper, past president of the Harvard Ornithological Club, quite a lot, which is the point he makes in his recent book, Better Living Through Birding. Notes from a Black man in the natural world, in which, by the way, he tells quite a few amusing stories about being a Black birdwatcher, and some less amusing ones. Because it was Christian Cooper who was the famous target of a white woman in Central Park who, when asked to leash her dog because it was scaring away the birds, responded like this.
I'm calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Here's where we confront real interculturality as it emerges from the lively entanglements of birds, people, mobile phones, police departments, and dogs. But at the same time, here is where we also confront, most uncomfortably, culture as a noun, whose nounness we don't want to ignore. Culture as an algorithm that potentially sets into motion a series of processes which could have actually become deadly for Christian Cooper, and which, in fact, on that very same day, just a few hours later, in another American city, turned out to be deadly for George Floyd. So no matter how non-essentialist we want to be, we can't escape the fact that this lively entanglement is actually a racializing assemblage that is oppressively solid. But ChatGPT doesn't want to talk about such things. The only way it can politely talk about bird watching and African Americans in the same sentence, it seems, is either to make them talk about hip hop and soul, or to get rid of them altogether and replace them with pencils. In other words, it can either essentialize or erase. Try to get AI to adopt an algorithmic understanding of diversity, and you end up with the glitch Google reported just a few days ago with its new model Gemini, which, in its efforts to be diverse, ends up rewriting history with some rather disturbing results. Missing the mark, indeed. The problem is, as Dominic mentioned, that culture is both noun and verb, both wave and particle, both a messy contingent phenomena that emerges out of the interaction among bodies, objects, animals, and tools, and a rather potent tool in itself, with very specific histories and very specific consequences for those who wield it. Scholars of intercultural communication can't afford to ignore either of these aspects of culture. Rachel Adams asked the question, can AI be decolonized? And she's not optimistic because, as she argues, once you start looking into the technologies that make AI and colonialism possible, you see they're based on the same logics of reification, classification, calculation, and the same narrow Western view of intelligence. Rather than just reproducing the logics of race and reaffirming the legacies of colonialism, she contends, AI actually depends on them. Juliana Ferre, who Dominic also referenced, asked the same question about intercultural communication studies and comes to much the same conclusion. As long as we depend on algorithmic ideas of interculturality and algorithmic solutions like diversity, intercultural communication will never be able to dismantle the cathedral of culture. In particular, she points out in so many words that language itself is the original culture machine, and that as long as we're using it, we're stuck in the territory of the colonist. Just as Ed Finn wonders what algorithms want, Umberto Eco once pondered what culture wants, and concluded that what cultures wants is not very different from what algorithms want: to make infinity comprehensible. It also wants to create order, not always, but often. Culture is how human beings face infinity, through making lists, catalogs, collections and museums, and I would add, commodities. But Eco's quote also points us back to the post-human, reminding us that neither culture nor algorithms are actually things. They are emergent entanglements of material objects, code, bodies, and minds. And perhaps if we remember our intracultural relationship with AI, that we ourselves are the culture machines, that there might be hope. This is the hope offered by Donna Haraway, who imagines what a cyborg world might be like, how it might be about lived social and bodily realities in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. It's also the hope that Ed Finn offers when he muses, like all of our other myths, the culture machine has been us all along. We build these tools, we imbue them with power and history because we seek to secure some part of ourselves outside this fragile vessel of the human form. We build cathedrals, rituals, and collective stories to cast a spell on ourselves, a nanshab of eternal memory, to keep our brightest moments alive. Understanding the figure of the algorithm is the first step to becoming true collaborators, and not just with the machines, but with one another through the vast collectives that algorithmic systems make possible. But there are also some potent critiques of the potentially universalizing gestures of post-humanism from people like Migalinos and Zembias, noting how in them the particularities of power and the relentlessness of its algorithmic operations are sometimes ignored or downplayed, as well as from Marxist scholars like Aaron Garde, who fear that it takes our gaze away from issues of ownership and exploitations, especially as manifested in the workings of the culture industry. If you want to evaluate the chances for decolonizing AI, instead of looking at the kinds of cybernetic human-machine collaborations that might be possible, we might look at the ends to which AI has thus far been deployed in our current neoliberal economies. Ends like targeting advertisements, evaluating loan and employment applications, testing students' language proficiency, and creating for us entertaining characters like FM Mika. All purposes that are built upon processes of reification and abstraction, processes of turning verbs into nouns. At some point, in the end of the day, it's not just about what algorithms want or what culture wants or what we want. It's about what Google and Meta and people like Anthony Martini want, which is to turn not just our pop idols, but also us into vessels for their commercial endeavors. So no matter how postmodern or post-human it becomes, intercultural communication studies in the digital age must always be first and foremost the study of power. And at this particular socio-technical moment, how power is exercised through the deployment of more and more sophisticated culture machines whose primary purpose is to relentlessly and ruthlessly turn us into nouns. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rodney, for this very, very rich and fascinating paper, which I think gives us all an awful lot of food for thought. Both papers do, in fact, present us with an awful lot of food for thought. Yeah, okay, so what we wanted to do was firstly ask one or two questions which hopefully can connect the papers so that you can sort of engage with each other, and then we would, after that, after 15 to 20 minutes, go into sort of a wider discussion. I think Dominic mentioned this in his paper in relation to the situation of language, and it was also central to Rodney's paper as well, actually. Language as the original culture machine, the original sort of generalizing force, the original sort of stereotyping force, I suppose. From both of your perspectives, where do you think, what do we do with this? What do we do with these facts and these sort of ideas that language is, okay, it is a generalizing force, but it is also something that we need to use to work as academics for obvious sort of reasons. That'll be, I suppose, the first question for both of you, if that's okay. Maybe Dominic, if you want to go first, since you had a longer break, then we can give Rodney sort of a few minutes to catch his
Okay,
breath.
well, yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, the question of language, well, just to recount that the idea was, or the accuse with the point of language was that actually language is a human-centered instrument, and even more if we engage in academic discourse, very often normally a Eurocentric discourse. And to decolonize all this, actually, we would radically have to strip away language and I don't know, start engaging in interacting in any kind of non-linguistic way. This is the radical claim of post-qualitative inquiry in particular. There are also critics in that strand who say this is exaggerated, just forget it. Yeah, but it would be the logical consequence. Now we had in Rodney's talk, we had the aspect that actually, as far as I understood, many languages are more or less first reduced to one, which might be either English or any kind of algorithmic language. Considering all these questions, what came to my mind was when listening about the questions how culturalist AI is. Isn't that one of the problems that we try to describe AI in a non-post-humanist way? We are asking the classical questions: does it have a culture? Does it have a conscience? What gender, what ethnicity does it have, and so on and so on. So actually, we are not post-humanized because we're asking the old questions. And actually, when we create AI and when we consider this as one aspect of entering a post-humanist age, actually, we should be the first ones to leave away these questions. Of course, on the other hand, there were very impressive examples showing that actually AI is always repeating us and echoing us, and of course echoing our stereotypes and the world, how it is shaped according to stereotypes, yeah, that it's a circular dilemma. On the other hand, I think this might be one aspect where we are not post-human enough to accept AI. On the other hand, I think we have turned a bit into a post-humanist mood that has been prepared since actually the 1980s by Haraway and so on, that opened up our minds to be ready to ask whether a machine has something human. Of course, the ideas are much, much older, maybe 200 years ago. Yeah, but on the other hand, there is a discourse, a post-humanist discourse that encourages us to perceive AI as equal to us. So actually, it's a circle. On the one hand, we are asking the old questions. On the other hand, we are open enough to consider it as one of us. And yeah, the initial question was about the language. Well, that should be seen in this context, actually. Yeah.
I'll try to work back to the original question from where Dominic, from the very interesting spaces that Dominic brought us to in answering it. This idea of AI as an intercultural interlocutor is actually quite interesting. And I think you're right that it is something that we have been kind of primed to imagine. The imaginaries that we build up around AI, even before the technology of AI really developed or evolved or emerged, are so central to the way we think about it and the way we use it. Even this kind of whole idea of a chatbot, AI as a conversational agent, rather than some other kind of agent. I think of that Ishiguro novel, Clara and the Sun. I don't know how many people have read this book. It's a book about the future where children have artificial friends, AI artificial friends. But what's fascinating about the book is it very much kind of pitches it as a book about intercultural communication, about these constant kind of small misunderstandings between the AIs and the humans, leading to a kind of final conclusion that it is the AI that are really the more human creatures, and the humans that have actually become quite mechanistic and algorithmic. So if you haven't read that book, I really recommend it. I also thought it was a very good point that Dominic made about this whole idea that, well, AI are algorithmic, AI are reifying language because we're using language to communicate with it. And whenever we're using language, then we start asking questions with this culture machine of language and creating personas. Can we even create a persona without some kind of reference to stereotype, right? Can we create a character, right? Without reference to some kind of stereotype. I mean, you would look at Mark Zuckerberg's AI persona, you know, all with the kind of voice of Snoop Dogg and Paris Hilton, and they're all cultural stereotypes. And cultural stereotypes very much kind of based on stereotypes that these pop images, that these characters in our culture are creating in order to commodify themselves. And so I think that brings me to where I think the real problem about sort of post-humanism and post-culturalism is that nouns are profitable, verbs aren't. Yeah, you can sell nouns. Yeah, you know, what would happen if Paris Hilton were really post-human? We're really this kind of ever-changing, emergent blob of stuff. Yeah, I'm afraid her publicist would not be very happy with that. I don't know what to do about the problem of language, the essentialization that comes with language. I can only resort to Tibetan Buddhism with lamas who talk about the difference between absolute reality and relative reality, and how you need to hold them both in your mind at the same time. You need to know that nothing is really true, or you need to know that it's a wave, while at the same time being able to deal on a day-to-day basis with the particleness of the world, while at the same time remembering that it's a show, that it's something that we're creating with our language. So being able to kind of have this kind of double consciousness, I think is a very important, I mean, I think a very important kind of ingredient in the post-human agenda as well, in terms of this kind of attention to our own kind of positionality as observers and how that always changes what is being observed.
Okay. Then, yeah.